Okay, so all of you have first the email that was sent, and some have received and some have not. And then just maps. Whoops, and my chewing gum. So when last I was here, there were just some questions, location questions, and some of that. And a lot of us are those kinds of visual learners, so I thought it might be helpful to just put some things in place in terms of the time and place, right? So just two maps to help you frame this time frame where various peoples would be, but then also to understand this would be locale. So as we're saying, so Samuel moved from here to here to here. So here you go. And it just might help as you're reading this. So you've got that. And then as I do some of the lecture today, I'm going to go back into the JEDP stuff that I talked about back in my Genesis lecture. And so this is some of the context for that if you want. If not, it's wonderful recycling. So, all right, but that's what you have, and I just figured it would be helpful as I move forward. And then wanting to make the most of our time, I'm just trying a different, we'll just leave that. Today, just lecture notes and then time for stump the chump kind of questions, right? So we'll go from that. That the book, or in our English books, right, of Samuel, along with Deuteronomy and Joshua, Judges, and what we have as First and Second Kings, right? The tradition holds that these are part of the Deuteronomic history, and that they first came into writing about 550 BCE, so before Common Era, or BC, but BCE, right? And that's that time period of the Babylonian exile. So just that reminder that we're talking about primarily the Davidic kingdom, which we have our estimation here, and then when we're writing is here. So if you're looking for people who are going to be telling these stories, they're 420 years old. All right, so we're telling the story while we're in exile, bemoaning and looking back on the glory days. Woohoo! So let's keep that in perspective. All right? So that's just really important to kind of know. And that if you don't know something, right, so that Babylonian exile or Babylonian captivity, either one of those you're going to hear, okay. It lasted anywhere from 48 to 70 years, depending on which scholars you're reading, okay? And the Chaldeans, which southern Babylonian, okay? It was a Mesopotamian practice, and that's what they were doing. They hauled their captives out. And when we say they hauled their captives out, they didn't haul everybody out. They hauled about 10,000 people out, and they hauled the scholars and the wealthy and those kind of work. Okay, so I'm going to read it. It's going to be from the Jewish Virtual Library. So let me get the exact, how do they want to describe it? The wealthy, I'm going to lose it. See, I told you I was going to follow my notes, and now I don't. So 10,000 people were forced to relocate to the city of Babylon, the capital of the empire. Judah itself basically ceased then. But they're hauling out. So the farmers, the real working class folks, were left. But anyone who was a craftsman or could be put to work in any of those sorts of really desired, they took them. So you left a people devastated. Unless, of course, you don't read that particular history. Because you've heard King Nebuchadnezzar, you know that name? So here's what Nebuchadnezzar did. He redistributed the land and the wealth. And the poor people who were left, he redistributed that land to them. And so if you were left and you were devastated, apparently it really wasn't as bad as you might think. But you can't tell that story because you're not one of the scholars who can write. Okay? But you have this split that we do hear about later on in terms of Judaism, because there are those who were taken into exile and those who were left. And there was this devastating famine, right? And we hear about that in Lamentations and the like, right? But what we don't hear is how all of the land was redistributed and those who were poor were given all of the land or those sorts of things. Which is also why I'm saying you have to pay attention to who writes the history and how these things, right? And I'm very thankful because I had never heard that before until I went into the Jewish Virtual Library and started reading. And they're letting us know that Nebuchadnezzar did that, right? So, and they're talking about the split and that those who were taken away into exile viewed themselves as the real and the authentic Jewish people and dismissed those who were left behind. And so we have a real bias that is getting fermented, okay? But we're going to get back to Samuel because this lecture is not on what Nebuchadnezzar did. All right? So, Samuel. This text is largely an original one. It's principally concerned with the origin, the early history of the monarchy of ancient Israel. The work bears the name of Samuel apparently because he's that first principal figure instrumental in the selection of the first two kings. Samuel is treated as a priest, right? He's Eli's successor. He's clearly viewed as a prophet. He's also a judge. Israel's principal figure immediately before the monarchy. 1 Samuel gives us Samuel's narrative, which we all read, right? It introduces to us Saul, head and shoulders above all others, as well as David. Okay? It's important to note that there are numerous parallels, repetitions, and discrepancies in the books of Samuel. So there are different accounts that are given of the origin of the monarchy. So 1 Samuel 9, 1 through 10, 16, and how that differs from 1 Samuel 8, and then 10, 17 through 27. Two accounts of the rejection of Saul as king. So 1 Samuel 13, 8 through 14, and then 1 Samuel 15, 10 through 31. And there are two introductions of David to Saul, if you guys saw that, right? So, all right. So know that that tension is there. And, all right. There's also one account of the Goliath slaying attributed to David, and you're going to encounter another slaying in 2 Samuel, not attributed to David. So just heads up for that when you get into 2 Samuel, and you'll go, now wait a minute. So there it is. But scholars will assume maybe that the books of Samuel were composed from 2 or 3 continuous sources, but there's another suggestion that this compilation is of independent narratives of varying lengths, and that at this point seems to be the wider accepted view. Okay? This independent narrative with examples of historical writing, especially the court history of David, again, you're going to see this in 2 Samuel, you're going to see it in 1 Kings, is an understanding that these independent narratives and fragments were collected by the Deuteronomic historian, and they were joined together in order to produce this work. Not just what we see, but you'll find these pieces in Deuteronomy and Joshua and Judges, and then 1st and 2nd Kings. The author has taken considerable care to use this traditional material, and everything is there to serve an overall theological perspective. So that's when we make sure that, just to remember that JEDP stuff, and that's why I gave you, right? Because this is all coming together because, and just to remember, when you bring various sources together, we want to say, well, isn't that weird or eh? But if you grab your Bible and go to the very beginning of your Bible, and check out your copyrights. Do you all have copyright dates that are more frequent than 70 years apart? Okay, so I have a copyright of 1991, and then 1973, 1977, 1962, 1965, and 1989. Okay, so copyright is the life of the author. Now, traditionally, right? Life of the author plus 70 years. Okay? So, and that's just common rule of thumb, and I haven't looked this up specifically with my Bible, but okay. So, if you have some other stuff in here, not necessarily, but could be, that other materials have been added, edited, right? So other materials have been added, edited. You have other stories, other narratives, other sightings. So while it sounds like I'm saying to you, what? That's not weird at all, right? We have other editions of things. Okay. So it's a new edition. The author added something, the author changed something, right? So we get updated editions of things all the time when we have updated information. Okay. And that's what we have. We have these stories, these narratives that are coming together and being updated. And all the more so when you're a people in exile and you are compiling this information and it's coming together because you have been taken out and you want to get the stories together and tell your story, right? So, these conflicting accounts, right? The origin of the monarchy reflecting pro or anti monarchy attitudes, they're intentionally held in tension as this backdrop for this divine promise that you see throughout the story, right? And the divine promise is given to the house of David. And you're going to see this so much, especially in 2 Samuel, right? So the author is setting all of this up because it's a guarantee, this promise, and also simultaneously a warning for any reigning king that Yahweh's going to get you, right? If you are not faithful to the laws of Moses, right? So it is this promise that we find in 2 Samuel, especially 2 Samuel 7, that divine favor is going to rest permanently on the Davidic dynasty, but it's crucial. And the theological movements and motivation throughout all of this, especially during the exilic period, this writer is hoping for restoration and convinced that restoration will only be recognized through the house of David, but only to the degree that people are faithful to the laws of Moses. And so you see how, right, David again and again, I will not strike the Lord's anointed. I will not, right? And Saul, portrayed as this iffy, right? So of course I swallowed the Kool-Aid. That's why I'm a David guy, right? But guy, David woman. So whatever. But it is all, what's the theology behind the story? And you can see the theology behind the story once someone starts to talk about it. You're going, oh yeah, I see this, right? And what's the story that's being told? And you can see how these various pieces that are in here fit in, and you're like, now I see why this fits. This would go right here to prove this point. I get this. But then it makes us begin to look and really see, who is writing our history? Now wait just a darn minute, right? Because all of this fits in, and the eyes that God gave us should not be removed when we read Scripture. It still is Scripture, but we still have every right to come into it and say, now, what's happening here? How are we reading this? And if I can see this way, then I can also see how this pertains to what's happening today. And, right? So it was Niebuhr that said, read the Bible and read the newspaper simultaneously. Let's go, right? And you can understand what's happening. So these are those pieces that I wanted us to begin to understand before we kind of delve in and say, so now tell me about the Witch of Endor. Tell me about, so what do we want to know? What do we want to know? If anything. Otherwise, short class.
It was surprising to me that David ended up being safe with the Philistines.
Uh-huh. You betcha. Isn't that a powerful piece to be in there? Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. When the guy who says, oh, you're right, my son. Mm-hmm. I will never come after you. I promise, I promise. Let's go kill him. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So where's Babylon on here? What would it be?
Those are my lecture notes. Oh, it's chewing gum. Beersheba. I need the bigger map. Hold on. Let me get back to you. I think Babylon's down. Hold on.
Now it's straight east of Damascus, way east. in Iraq. But that might not be the same location.
So let me get the map.
So it's Mesopotamia, which is west.
All right, so if Israel is, so I'm holding it upside down. So if Israel's here, then Babylon's going to be here.
It's like right above the Persian Gulf.
So here. My finger is Babylon.
So it's east of Damascus?
That's
This is
probably
modern day
that's probably
Iraq.
different.
So it would be.
It would be modern day Iraq.
But Iraq is to the east, isn't it?
It's hard to tell the directions on here, but I think it's
Oh, I think it's
west.
Okay, right.
So here's
You put this
So when I'm
in
holding a
there.
map like this, I can't do north,
Right.
south, but I can, so if
The Mediterranean
Judah's
Sea-
here and Israel's here, then it would be here.
It's up here.
Yeah,
Here.
I think
Oh, now you're on that map.
Karen's on it.
Yeah. Yeah, well, Israel, same thing. It would still be up over here. I mean, this is a Mediterranean
So if that's
Sea,
Damascus,
so
we're going to be up
be
here,
up
right?
Yeah,
in there somewhere.
so northeast.
You have it directly down Babylon. Okay, so the whole thing, all the Babylonians are here. So the exile happened somewhere in here. You know, I don't know exactly
Yeah.
where they were put into exile, but what I don't know is it's east or west. Is the Mediterranean,
Is west.
the Mediterranean is west?
Yes.
That's the part that I can't always figure out. I get turned around.
So next time when I print a map, I'm going to do the north, south, east, and west thing here, because I have to, right? That's it. As a dyslexic, I'm sitting here now going, I only know that way is west because that's where the door
I
is,
know where the lake is.
right? Because otherwise I have to kind of turn around, and then I always have to hold the map in the right and turn the map around and go, okay, so that means that Babylon's that way. So I'm
There's
like,
also,
well,
you know, that's 400 years later than
yeah,
what we're reading about
Right.
today.
yeah,
That is, she was talking about
yeah,
writing it there.
right. So it doesn't exist yet.
Yeah,
So
another empire.
And
Mhm.
Moab, I know I looked this up, but
Yeah.
It's closer to Egypt, isn't it?
So we actually exist on one of these maps, right? Yep.
Too small for me to read.
Yeah. You're going to ask the dyslexic map questions. Ask me questions about the text.
Okay, here's one.
Thank you.
There's the phrase, an evil spirit from God rushed upon Saul.
Yes,
That came up a couple times, I think.
it sure did.
Several.
Even though right before it, what it said was God's spirit left Saul and an evil spirit came upon Saul. And it clearly differentiated the evil spirit from the Spirit of God. And then it was later that that spirit was attributed to God. And so the rabbis disagree about this one, which is no surprise, right? But what you can see is that originally, and you also get some of the tradition of like when you sneeze, right? Right? And immediately the God bless you. Because that understanding is that that immediate rush of air out leaves an emptiness. And unless you say God bless you, right? There's the possibility that an evil spirit will rush in you and fill that vacancy of outrushed air. So,
You're saying he sneezed?
so, right? But this is where some of this weird stuff, right? But that's the part that comes from there. So, if we remember that whole part of did God actually harden Pharaoh's heart, or did God allow Pharaoh's heart to remain hardened and refuse to intercede? So go with the original part of the text, which is God's spirit left, and whatever that evil spirit was. So it all will rest upon, and again, what's the theology? Do you believe that there is an evilness in God? And that would be anathema, right? So for the evil spirit from God, God would have to have an evil entity to, right? So while it is true that God is God over everything, the question is whether there is an evil spirit entity, right, of God. So instead, God would cease to intervene, and therefore, and that's where that one comes in. So God's spirit had left that emptiness in Saul, and therefore evil was allowed to enter in. And that's where that one kind of comes in. Unless theologically you believe that there is an evil, and that is not a theology that,
right, because isn't archangel becomes the devil or something?
well,
And that, it was
So
God
there's
made the
one-
archangel, so
there's one camp that believes that, or you could understand that maybe another version of that is that the devil, right, is that of the prosecuting attorney, right, and that the job is to bring charges against, and can you withstand? And so that maybe there's not an evilness in that, but just fulfilling divine law and perspective. So, but yes, it is. It's another way of looking at that. So, how do you wish to do that? So, proceed accordingly.
So, it's probably gonna be way off. So,
It's all theology.
is it that the devil is telling God that the God that I know would never do these things?
Right.
So he's doing, the devil is stronger than God at this time, or is he still doing these things? Am I? When I read that God says, "Do this, kill them, whatever," that's a hard thing for me because I don't
Yep.
see our God, the God that doing that.
Right.
And I've never read the Old Testament.
Yeah.
Right. So this is real new, and I'm trying to understand why. Like this.
So, it is very, very hard. So, it's also part of understanding the setting in life. So, if you have been conquered and taken, okay, you're struggling with what did we do wrong, right? So clearly we have erred and strayed in some way, because when we were, I'm tossing this out, when we were faithful to God, we won. Right?
Yeah.
So let's put that theology out there. Doesn't work for me, but let's put that out there, okay? Because you can build a monarchy on that. Because if we're faithful to God, God will give us the victory. My God is stronger than your God, and my God can beat you up. Okay? Hence the, my God's bigger than the boogeyman. That's a VeggieTales thing, okay? But at a certain primary level, all right, there's a way in which you begin, well, we'll call them theological building blocks, right? If you're primarily afraid, then you have to have a big God who can beat up the others. Let's look at the story of David and Goliath. What does it teach you? Okay, so a lot of this is going on in here as Israel is wrestling with this theology, because there's something fundamentally wrong, because the biggest and the strongest get slayed by a little rock in the head. Okay, so something doesn't work, but it worked until it didn't. So what's that mean? And this is, right? So the author's going through all this stuff. And when you're wrestling with it, and it's a theology, you're laying it at God's door, right? Because this is about, what does it mean to be faithful? And how is God faithful back to you? Okay? So in the end, and I'm sure Scott covered this, I'm so sorry I didn't watch last week's lecture. Does this mean that God actually said, let's go slay 4,000 people? Or did you have a battle in which you slayed 4,000 people and you're faithful to God, and so you give thanks that you won? Okay? And in that case, when you're telling the story and remembering the glory days, God gave you that victory. All right? And there are right? So how are you going to look at that? And remember, it's 400 years later. And all the people that lived through having to do that massacre are long dead. And they can't tell you what it meant to kill somebody that day. It's one thing to live through the battle. It's another thing to retell Grandpa's story. Great Grandpa's story. Okay? Always remember, when did it happen? Who did it happen to? And who's telling the story? Is this an eyewitness account? Is this somebody who's actually missing a limb? Or is this somebody who's living in the glory shadow? Or not even that, because you don't know these people. You just know the stories. And you're trying to make sense of your life right now. Okay? It doesn't mean it's wrong. Okay? There's a truth to tell that's in here, because this person is alive. They're in exile. They made it through something, right? And that God is alive to them. And this is their story. But King David isn't their king. Exile is their reality. And they're trying to figure out, how do we get from here to here? And how can we get back? Right? So, what happened? What happened to us? Right? We're in a mel of a hess. So, and that's a question we can, right? So, we're here in America. It's 200 years later, and we're in a mel of a hess. How'd that happen? Right? Got it? Story of the Revolutionary War. Civil War. We're in a mel of a hess. How do we get there?
Something that gives me comfort.
Yeah.
With the difficulties of the Old Testament, and I didn't mark them all, but I found one, especially in our image of God and how violent this seems to be, and if God is telling them to do. Certainly we know that the people are way violent. But in that time, just this is one example, and I encourage you just to watch for them. When David is getting ready, he's confronted Goliath, and they're talking these horrible trash. You know, I'm going to cut you into pieces and feed you to the wolves and blah blah blah, all that kind of stuff. And it's chapter 17, verse 47. David says that all this assembly may know that the Lord does not save by sword and spear.
Yes.
Because he came really just with a pack of rocks, you know, against this huge person. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. I mean, those are the little things that I hang on to that are kind of few and far between in all of this massacres and horrible things that is being attributed to God. Whether or not God did it, the people are attributing this to God.
Yeah.
And every now and again you get a little phrase like that that makes me feel better about, well, it kind of gets back to how's the story being told. You know, how did that little phrase get in there amongst all this other stuff? And yes, he ended up killing him, you know, which still doesn't make us feel very good, but it wasn't by the sword and spear, even though he cut him up afterwards. you know, I mean, some of this brutality, sometimes I just wonder if it's human beings have gotten a little more peaceful is the wrong word, but we're not so gross, you know, except in war. You know, we see people like Putin and Prigozhin and stuff like that that do horrible things. But for the most part, human beings seem to have a little more restraint than we did 5,000 years ago. I hope. I don't know. I hope. that we've evolved a little bit, you know, in our caring of others.
I have my questions about that.
Well, as a whole, there are still some, yeah.
In this
As a
moment, in
whole,
this
there's
room.
little baby steps that have been made in our human condition, I hope.
There are certain TV shows we will not watch, so we don't challenge that theory.
Okay.
So, yes. So, but, and the news might be one of them. But, yeah. And thank you for that, because, yes.
So I have a
Verses or
question.
stories. Yes,
So I
please,
have a
go.
question.
Yeah.
When the ark was, they were moving the ark,
Mhm.
and I noticed 70 people were killed. They were priests because they looked into the ark.
Uh-huh.
But then the one guy who, I believe it shifted, and then he died.
Yep.
That, I mean, I didn't quite understand why he was killed.
Mhm.
Is there?
Because he stumbled and tried to, it stumbled and he tried to, yeah.
Yeah.
Seems like God forgives some things so easily and other things,
Not.
Right.
such tiny little things.
For
I
certain
know,
people to
right?
get away with
Yeah,
it.
David can,
Uh-huh.
somebody killed so he can have the wife, and
I
that's
know.
okay, but
Yeah, God plays favorites, right? I just don't want to think about that
some guy
either.
stumbles and,
Uh-huh.
strike him dead.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Is it because the ark is so sacred? I know it was, but still, I mean,
Yes.
he was trying to right, the problem.
Yes. So, in theory, if I understood this, and let us not believe that I understood this, trying to come in and to run up and rescue God would not be necessary. Because, again, we're telling a theology. So the Ark of the Covenants, right? So the dwelling place of God, the chutzpah, right? Do you think I need you, O mortal, to steady me? No. So,
Zappo, to you.
right?
He needed
So,
you to carry it, though.
yeah. But if you're if what we're saying, right, is that God is, you don't need to steady God, God is the steady. So God doesn't need you to rescue God, God will rescue you. So let's keep it all in perspective. That's a possible way to interpret that. That doesn't make me swallow that bitter pill any better. Doesn't make me like it. But it made me say, okay, that's a possible interpretation for that. Do you need me to find some others?
The Tower
So-
of Babel would be another one, you know.
Yes.
God gets ticked off because they're gonna be like, people are gonna be like us, let's confuse them and
Uh-huh.
scatter them all over the place.
Yes,
you know. Sometimes
absolutely.
It seems that God's ego needs a little attention, you know, I
Mhm.
don't know.
Yeah,
But it reads that way.
it certainly does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, that God is in need of, right? And if you're trying to portray a theology, not the theology I'd be going for, but I didn't write it. I just read it and study it and go, I need a different explanation, please. But,
And I say this man is talking about God, and man doesn't know exactly what God is. And so I always have to step back and say there are human factors in there. And
yes,
so that helps me to rationalize better what I see, that God is that furious one that tells you to go. I don't think so. But I think that they can't help but factor in their feelings and what's happening around them. I just don't see how that could possibly be. So I have a very hard time with the Old Testament. And I've never read it. I'm like, I know the story about Eli and Samuel and how he keeps hearing being called, and he says, there's blocks of it that in there very precious to me, but the rest of it, it's hard. I keep saying, I don't think I get it. I just won't read it. And so I'm forcing myself to look at it and say, stop, and take it in, and remember that you might have been inspired by God, but there was still their human factor, because they wrote it eventually. And that was somebody else who wrote it.
Yeah. I have an equally hard time with the New Testament, sometimes even worse. So Old Testament is a little easier for me. So,
Well,
but
that's
yep.
difficult questions. Like, here's Hannah dumping a toddler on Eli.
Uh-huh.
That seems a little weird.
Yeah,
How about waiting until he's, 16 or something?
Well, by then it's too late.
Practice, or it wasn't it? So,
They did wean later.
They did.
Wean as early
But like
as
2,
Right.
right?
Well, I think maybe he could have been 6, or I mean, again, that's always how I heard it. Is that
Yeah.
they weaned much later than what we do, and
Yeah.
what does that weaning really mean? Is it the same meaning today as it was then?
Right.
When they had no need of mom so much anymore, and they were independent. Manhood happened at 13 or 14, right?
Right.
Mhm.
So if you gave him over at 5 or 6, those would just be formative years to teach.
or does that word go beyond even just breastfeeding? It's
Correct.
raising them up till they're
Exactly.
Yeah.
somewhat
Exactly.
independent,
Mhm.
or near puberty or something.
Right.
It
Right.
could have been 10.
Right. We
But
just
it's-
don't know.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so
even
it's-
for a mom who waited, for me, the struggle with that story was always, Mom waited forever for this child.
Uh-huh.
And yet to keep that promise, to bargain with God, if you do this, this is what I will do.
Yep.
But to keep that promise, it's amazing
See
faithfulness.
him once a year after that.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
But that it is, right, it's that promise that the education and all of that belongs to the priest,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I'll send the child to school, right? And that's what it is. So, yeah.
That's another way, that's a great way of saying that.
That's so, yeah.
They had a lot of faith in Eli.
Well,
I'd say a lot of faith in God.
me too.
Yeah. Eli's a little iffy.
Giving your child over to somebody.
Well, she made the promise to God, and I guess trusted God, that God would then see to it that
Yeah.
that he was well taken care of.
And then if that didn't happen, she'd probably be killed. God would have struck her down.
Yeah, that could be. Yeah.
Only if she tried to touch the ark. If it
We're
stumbled.
always making these vows and stuff. It's like,
Yeah.
so a lot of them are crazy.
Backfire.
Yeah, like the one in Judges, where he vowed, the
Vowed
first
to-
person that comes out of my
Right.
house,
Right.
you
Mm-hmm.
know, and then
That's-
follows through with it.
That was pagan thinking, right?
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
I think a lot of vestiges of paganism are in our Old Testament.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you don't just cut that off.
And that's what God was trying to
Yeah.
avoid.
Yeah.
The culture around you finds its way into,
Absolutely.
right? I mean, you can't help but. That's how it goes. Other questions, comments, cries of shock, outrage, horror?
I was surprised that Jonathan died.
That was sad,
Yeah.
wasn't it?
Some things made me laugh, like David pretending to be a madman.
Well, yes, and the drool coming down
Yeah,
his
drool
beard.
And then the king like,
Uh-huh.
don't I have enough madmen? I don't need another one.
When you think about the detail of that story,
Uh-huh.
again, you can just kind of for me, I think about them sitting in exile around the campfire. You remember the one that David did this, you know, and all this stuff coming out of his mouth, you know? I mean, you can just sort of imagine how that came out. You know?
Yeah, that's a good one, put that one in there.
That's right. Write that one down, write that one down. Yep, yep. Yeah. But David fulfilled his promise, right? And took
Absolutely did.
the children in, that,
Yeah.
right? The lineage will not die, so.
Is Saul also among the prophets? Is some sort of thing?
Yeah,
We're
right.
like, we're gonna start saying, instead of saying what the heck, we're gonna say.
Is Saul also among the prophets?
We sort of gave
right. You go into a
negative
frenzy.
connotation to the prophets sometimes, didn't it? I mean, sometimes it felt, okay, sometimes the prophets are good, and that they are the mouthpiece for God, but in these frenzies, I sort of just got this undercurrent in me that felt like, oh, maybe they're just crazy people, you know, maybe that's how they're seen, you know, and not necessarily as being the word of the Lord, you know. I don't know, it's just a feeling that rises in me when I read stuff, those frenzy things, you know, what does that mean?
Well, don't you think that's how they're, I mean, let's look at we're not looking at Ezekiel, but let's look at Ezekiel, right?
Yeah.
And especially if you're in a time of exile, what do you imagine the prophet looks like, right?
John the Baptist.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. They are these crazy people that just, right, lay out there unwashed and it's like, you people are nuts, right?
Yeah.
Until they're not, right? And that prophetic voice is proven true. And then you go, oh, well, darn it. Guess Uncle Larry was right, you know, but they are. You go into this frenzy and then, oh, it's the normal people who are crazy. Uh-huh. And doesn't that just sit awkwardly in the middle of the room? Mm-hmm. So, yeah. Yeah. It's one of those powerful moments when you call it out. Mm-hmm. Yep. Anything else, beloveds? Questions or things that came to you?
Why is Samuel divided into two books? Samuel 1 and Samuel 2.
It's really long.
Okay.
So be grateful.
Okay.
So be grateful.
Same with First and Second
Stay
Kings.
divided.
They're
So-
long, they go on forever.
Okay.
Yeah. And there's an easy dividing spot.
Okay.
Pretty much the same argument's going to be made for why Luke and Acts are divided,
Okay.
all right? Because it's right, it's a whomping narrative,
Okay.
and there's an easy dividing spot. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Easy place to tear the scroll.
I was gonna say, were they smart enough back then to even think that, working on these scrolls, and that's too long, we're just gonna cut that in half.
Were they smart enough? Yes. That may not be the question we're asking. So, the intellect of the ancestors not in question. The attention span of the reader currently might be the answer we're seeking, or something along those lines of, yeah. Or perhaps it might have to do with the printing press. So, yeah. Yeah. This is the final call, and then my gavel's going down. Going once? Twice? May the peace of Christ go with you, and the love of God sustain you. Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you.